right, let's shift our attention now to election demarcation and its impact on communities. Boundary changes determine where people vote, which ward they belong to and who represents them. Let's unpack why demarcation matters and what voters need to know before election day. For more on that, we're joined now by Michael Sutcliffe, who is Director of City Insight and former Chairperson of the Municipal Demarcation Board. It's good to see you, Mike. It's been a while.
Very nice to see you. Yeah, been a while, and I'm sorry that you didn't give Sai a hard time last.
Well, he'll get it next time. There are two types of boundary changes, Mike, that I'm aware of that occur frequently ahead of an election, such as the one we are headed to in November. There's municipal boundary demarcation, and then there's ward delimitation. And I suppose, as a starting point, help ground all of us. What is each of those processes, and how do they differ between the two of them?
Well, for this election, we had very few outer boundary changes. So the outer boundary is the extent of your municipality. eThekwini, for example, has a particular boundary to it. And the only adjustments that were made this time were really fairly small, often technical adjustments, where you, for example, found a community that was just outside and they were brought in or whatever, or there was a traditional area, etc. So those haven't really impacted. So we still have the 257 municipalities that we had before. Of those, 44 are district municipalities, and then you have something like 205 local municipalities within those 44 districts, and then your 8, often people refer to them as metropolitan areas. So those stay largely the same. What does change in each election is the wards within that. So what happens is it's done by COGTA. They provide a formula for how many councillors there should be for how many registered voters there should be per councillor. So in a place like Richtersveld, just to give you a sense, there's on average about 1,000 persons per ward in each of the each of the wards in Richtersveld. But if you come to eThekwini, for example, some of the wards have as many as 24,000 voters in a ward there. Because obviously, depending on how many councillors there are and how many overall voters there are, it would vary across the country a lot. And that's why often in the elections, you'd remember in the 2024 elections, there was a lot of panic because particularly wards around near Wits University, for example, there were long queues, etc. So that's always the challenge that people like Sai have, because the smaller wards, you can finish those in maybe an hour. You've got everyone there. But in the bigger wards, you have a problem there. So these adjustments that Sai was talking about now, my guess is that they're not going to make a huge difference in the municipalities. The reality is, and I think that's probably your next question, is the reality we have in South Africa is that we still have the effects of the apartheid geography with us. So 82% of those wards in our country, in fact, have over 50% of the people there are Black Africans, South Africans. About 9% of the wards have people who were defined as coloured before. About 5%, I think it is, 4 or 5%, have people who were white. So those are the ones where there's a majority of one of those three population.
So a big takeout from what you just said there, apologies for that, Mike, a big part takeout for me has to do with the proportional representation element.
Yes.
Is that part of the answer? That
that's exactly.
Depending on the size of the population, the projection of that population's vote needs to reflect in the number of councillors that are allocated. Yeah.
Let me use an international example. It's not at a council level, but if you look at the the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, you think, oh, they won the elections, they have 60% of their MPs are in fact from the Labour Party. Actually, those 60% of the seats came from 30% of the voters. Now, South Africa is the most proportional country in the world. In other words, we make sure that even if you might win a ward, all the other votes of the other parties that voted there, they go into the makeup of the proportional representation. So sometimes your bigger parties, certainly historically it's been the ANC, the DA, in KZN, the IFP, those parties have often won wards with overwhelming majorities, sometimes 70, 80%, they've won them. but their overall total for the municipality might only be 50%, in which case they get fewer proportional representations because our constitution says your votes must all be of equal value. So even though you might find, and often you find there's huge contestation at a ward level, so sometimes someone is winning the ward with maybe 35% of the vote, but actually with the proportional representation system that we have, which is the most, we've got to be proud of the fact it's the most proportional system in the world.
And a quick qualification then, Mike, is that because the population changes in many of these areas between the 5 years, right? Especially in the urban centers, no.
When we devised the constitution, we said we want to make sure that we're not building a constitution like existed before when the National Party ruled for years, where you had a system where it was first past the post. We said collectively,
yes.
Constitution, we want to make sure that it's proportional representation.
I hear that part, but I was asking about the need to readjust the numbers and the formulae for the representation. Is it because there are population changes in between the 5 years?
Well, there are population changes, so the ward boundaries might change within the elections there, but that's only because each ward must be roughly the same size in the number of registered voters.
Right.
But that's not that just happens because you do have not as much people shifting. It's young people now coming on stream. So you've now maybe in an area it might be older. People who have grey hair like me, people who are younger are coming onto the ballot box, as it were. Yeah.
Mike, there's a final question that I must ask. It has to do with a common concern that you often hear about the redrawing of boundaries, and it's called gerrymandering. The redrawing of boundaries in favor of the incumbent political parties and to the disadvantage of the opposition. Does that happen in our country? I saw an example. How easy is it, for example, to do it? An example that I saw, the DA's complaints about the demarcation or delimitation in Gamagara local municipality, and that's out in the Northern Cape, where they are saying that the redrawing of the boundaries just doesn't make sense other than if viewed as seeking to favor the ANC and the EFF. That example of alleged gerrymandering, how easy or how difficult is it to engage in gerrymandering in our system?
Well, we wouldn't call it gerrymandering. There's no doubt that it might be seen in that way, that it's favoring a particular political party. But in theory, in that particular case, the DA, all of the DA's votes would still go towards getting councillors for the DA. They might have a much higher proportion of, we call them PR councillors, proportional representation councillors, than their ability to win wards. So you don't really have what historically, what is in the literature called gerrymandering, because you have a proportional representation system. But certainly, you know, there's often that feeling that sometimes a boundary might have been shifted to favor a party, but sometimes it can work against that party, that it happens because they become complacent. They then don't bring out their voters in their quote-unquote ward. That affects their overall size of their vote later.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of evidence to show that it's not really gerrymandering, and in fact it can work against parties that you get it, irrespective of whether it's the ANC or the EFF or DA or whatever.
Yeah.
Historically, the ANC and the DA dominate at a ward level, but they then the rest of the seats get shared amongst a much greater group of parties.
All right, thank you for coming through and sharing your insights. It makes far more sense now that we've had this conversation. That's Michael Sutcliffe, the Director of City Insight. He is also the former chairperson of the Municipal Demarcation Board, and we were talking there about issues to do with boundary redrawing, delimitation, ward delimitation, and how that fits in with the conversation around the elections for which we've had the final voter registration weekend.